Alright everyone, it's time to talk about a little bit of 2020 poll analysis. We're going to look just at the Democrats because with the Republican side we know who the nominee is. It's Donald Trump, so he will be running against whoever the Democrat is. First, let me flesh out what I briefly spoke of yesterday for the elucidation of those who are unaware. I am perfectly aware of the fact that the Democratic Party uses proportional delegate allocation. In the Republican Party, it's like a free-for-all. It's kind of weird. In some states, it's winner take all. In some states, it's proportional. In some states, it's some weird hybrid. And then you've got the superdelegate system, which sort of outweighs everything else. That's sort of like the Democrats like a lot of centralization. That's sort of their answer to a bicameral system. That's sort of like the Senate of the primaries, so to speak. It's rich, moneyed interests who are not beholden to voters, who are actually choosing the candidate. That being said, though, going forward, when I analyze these polls, when I talk about the idea of who I think is likely to win, like in a state or in general, when I say Biden has an advantage, Sanders' main advantage is New Hampshire, here's what can happen over the next 3 or 4 states, and they interact with one another. What I'm saying is mostly optics and perception among the public that's actually going to be voting. I realize that the delegate structure is different, but if you have one candidate running away with it in the first 4 states, they're going to become the nominee, even if they won by slim margins and other people still have quite a few delegates. Because the victory that they have will be perceived of as so complete, the electability issue for them is off the table. On everyone else's tables, they probably win by default. Let me open up by saying the obvious. Joe Biden is the undisputed frontrunner of the Democratic field. Since long before he even got in, and this is something most people I don't think even realize, since before he was even a candidate, months before he announced, back when he was waffling around saying, well, maybe I'll run, maybe I won't, and he was still included in polling because he was consistently ahead, there has never been a single poll conducted by a single polling firm that ever showed anyone else ahead of him. In fact, I think the closest was he was only 4 or 5 points ahead at one point when Bernie Sanders was peaking, and it looks like Bernie Sanders has hit a slump. Now, let me look solely right now at trajectories for the candidates, and I've got the RCP thing open here so I can actually look at the graph. One thing's important. If you're looking short-term over the last couple of months, it looks like Biden is losing steam, but if you look long-term, he's got a slow upwards trajectory. That is, he has now evened out again at that stubborn level. We're talking 32, 33% is around where he is. Roughly a third of the Democratic Party is stubbornly supporting him. That has risen over time. It was maybe only in the upper 20s. Now it's somewhere almost in the mid-30s. He can easily become the nominee with that level of support. Here's Biden's problem. Biden's problem is Joe Biden's nature in making gaffes. He's already had one with the Hyde Amendment, which, by the way, is why after peaking, he started to slump down. If you look at this graph, you'll notice that his peak, he was riding at 35, 36. He lost about 3 points of support thereafter. That was a big problem for him. If he does that 2 or 3 more times, he could be in trouble. Here's the thing, though. Once the voting begins for the states, if he can hold off and just do an okay job at the debates, he will probably become the nominee. His road to victory, as I've said, starts in Iowa. He's got to win Iowa or be a very, very strong second-place finisher and hope Bernie Sanders isn't the winner in Iowa. If Sanders wins Iowa, it flips the tables on Biden because he probably rushes into New Hampshire and wins it, gets a boost everywhere else, and pretty soon he looks like he's electable. The big problem for Sanders is that he doesn't look electable. The centrists don't like him for his socialist platform. The left doesn't like him because he's white male. And so he's got this problem where his main problem is he's got to set himself up and say, look, I'm the only one that can beat Trump. See, I'm even beating Joe Biden, and you're all about electability. You should come to my, side here. And then he can be the nominee. And that takes us into number 2, which is Bernie Sanders. He has begun to lose support against both Warren and other people within the race. Less Biden now. He already hemorrhaged a bunch of support to Biden, which now has become part of Biden's new floor, which I think is somewhere around 30, with a ceiling at 40 or thereabouts, which is pretty strong considering the number of people in the race. Bernie Sanders, if you look at his trajectory, he had been on an upward slope, but lately, since March or thereabouts, it's been mostly downhill. His shine has worn off. He peaked too early, in other words. Now, he hasn't had his rising star moment, and he may never get one. Remember, not every candidate in the race is going to have a moment where they shoot on ahead. And that brings us to number 3, which is Warren. Check this against 2016, you'll notice a similarity. It's just a case of, do we believe that Elizabeth Warren, who's rising right now, she's almost even with Sanders, she's a couple points behind him, and this isn't an aggregate. We're looking at aggregated polling numbers, not single polls. Never use a single poll, they're not reliable. Only use an aggregate, that's a much better. If you get a sort of a scattershot look, and the real number is somewhere in the middle, that's an aggregate. The aggregate's presumably a lot closer than any individual polling result. Do we think that Elizabeth Warren is a Ben Carson, or do we think she's a Marco Rubio? My money's on the latter. I don't think that she's going to systemically collapse. I think that she's going to stay the third wheel candidate shortly behind Bernie Sanders. And I think much like Rubio and Cruz strangulated one another and kept either one from being the anti-Trump, within certain parts of the party, you're looking for an anti-Biden. There are more people who dislike Biden, I think, than like him. It's just that he has all the centrists and business Democrats already amalgamated, the never leftists, you could call them. The thing is, a fairly decently strong Sanders, fairly decently strong Warren, unless they do something spectacular, they're just going to prevent one another from being a contender for Biden. He could end up running away with it quite easily because of the fact that they're both in the race. I'm sure that after the first debate, whichever one looks weaker will be called on to drop out. They won't. Nobody probably will. In a perfect world for the Democrats, the bottom half of the field would drop out after the first debate. Essentially, the people in the top rung that got to the adult debate would stay in, and the 1 or 2 people that did well at the kiddie debate, which they'll have, would join the adults table. And then you'd thin the field and you'd have a much easier idea of where the race is going. The other problem for analyzing the 2020 Dem primaries is really the fact that you have so many people in the field. There are half a dozen people that aren't even on this list, like Mike Gravel, that don't technically have a political pulse. Then you have fourth place, and this is where you round out the viable candidates, and this is a tie between Harris and Buttigieg. Now, Beto O'Rourke has fallen to 6th place now, so he's no longer viable. He rose up quickly, like right off the bat, and then flared out very quickly. He's done for as a candidate. I don't know who you'd compare him to. Probably that woman who ran Hewlett-Packard, never quite made it to the upper tier and then faltered back down. And sort of nobody knows anything about her anymore. I don't even remember her name. Was it Fiorina? Maybe. If that's actually true, I'm probably the only one that remembers. But basically, you've got room in the race for 5 people. Only 5 because you've got a tie for 4th place, basically. Otherwise, basically, you have 4 viable contenders. The thing is, in a race this packed, if someone is the clear long-term front runner and doesn't systemically collapse, they win. So if I'm looking at these polls, I would say there's a 90% chance Joe Biden is going to be the nominee. That could change, though, if one of 3 things happens. He or some other candidate has a major health crisis or dies, or unexpectedly drops out from scandal. So someone is removed from the race. That could shake things up. Could be Biden, could be Sanders, could be anyone. If Sanders were to croak tomorrow, Elizabeth Warren would probably grab up most of his support and become a viable secondary contender. It was the same as if Warren were to croak. I think that Bernie Sanders would absorb most of that. Or, number 2, Biden specifically does really poorly at the debate, or Biden makes a major gaffe, or multiple gaffes. Now, it's likely that he will make at least, considering his track record, I'd say it's good. It's better than 50-50. He has another major gaffe before the first debate. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And once you get into voting, once the first 3 or 4 states are in, certainly after Super Tuesday, it won't matter what he does. By then, we'll know who the nominee is. We will know who the nominee is the day after Super Tuesday. That's the way that it goes. It will be clear unless there is a statistical tie between 2 or more candidates because of the proportional system in the delegate structure. But because of the internet-driven nature of races now, I think that you'll see that it's a little bit different than like Obama and Clinton being close to each other long ago. I think that you'll see that it becomes much more democratized, arguably, because people will perceive a reality that's different. They don't give a shit about the delegate system. They don't know anything about what a delegate is, what a delegate does, how they're allocated, how they function. They don't know anything about it. They just know who won the state. And that's all. They know who won the state, and they'll know if they're watching CNN, they'll know the delegate count. Otherwise, they couldn't care less. I couldn't care less. The delegate count doesn't even matter until the end when everything's tallied up and you supposedly know who will be running the party into the ground probably in 2020. It does until then, however, matter what people perceive of because of the electability issue. This is an electability referendum election on Donald Trump in which the Democrats are strangulating themselves. Lichtman is saying that if they don't try to impeach, he probably wins re-election, that they could actually knock a key off of Trump if they did. I happen to slightly disagree with his surmising here. But I mean, it's possible. It's a gamble they might be willing to take because, I mean, if they're looking at the field and they're looking at the possibility of Joe Biden being the standard bearer of the party. I mean, you look at the alternatives here. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren really round out the viable candidates per se. None of these people are particularly eminently qualified to run against somebody like Donald Trump. Warren has behavioral issues and long-term baggage that he would easily exploit. He already has. It would work. Bernie Sanders is geriatric and a socialist, and Joe Biden is old. He's prone to making mistakes. He's got a Me Too problem. I would say all of these candidates are relatively on the weak side. But looking at the polls still, 90% chance of a Biden. Most of the rest of that 10% goes to a fusion of Sanders and Warren at this point. There's an outside chance somebody else does so well in the first debate. They just shine and they do a stellar job and they get, $100 million in corporate donations overnight and they become the front runner. That's possible. It's just not particularly likely. That sort of redemption story doesn't really happen within modern politics very easily. Most likely, someone crashes and burns after they rise up. They fly too close to the sun, so to speak, and then, they get fucked. That's about all. Peace out.